Hi everyone, welcome to another painting tutorial from Promethean Paints. Today we're painting the Ork Weirdboy from the Armageddon box set. I expect this lunatic will be available as a separate model as he is pretty awesome looking. As you can see, I did a slight conversion. I snipped the top part of his staff off and replaced it with a Deadly Print 3D bit. You can buy the STLs or the whole parts from them. I buy the whole bits. It's a sort of a double flamer end piece, and then I just stuck it onto the end of the staff. A little bit of super glue, a little bit of green stuff and putty just to make it look like the flames are connecting to it. Then I base coated the whole of the model in Army Painter's matte black primer through the airbrush, and then painted most of the flame in AK Intense White. Now we're going to be doing the green glow first, just because we're going to be getting a little bit of OSL through this on some other parts, and I just wanted to get this done out of the way in case there's a lot of overspray. So what I'm doing here is I'm just using the sort of halo and gradient effects you get with the airbrush with some Liquitex white ink, and I'm just spraying it so that I'm just making sure the whole of the flame is covered, and that we've got a little bit of overspray just going over the bottom part of the flame effect, and that it is like really pure white. And as you know, for our fluorescent colours, to get a nice bright fluorescent finish, they're really great starting from a pure white base. So now we're going to hit it with some AK fluorescent green. I do water this down a little bit only because it's mega hot today, so it is drying out a little bit quicker. But generally just one little drop of water in the airbrush is all you'll need, and then just carefully, as we do, a few sharp short sprays with the airbrush, many coats, very thin coats, especially with these fluorescent colours. They are really pigment rich, but they can be quite thick, and if they come out the airbrush too quickly they will spider web and pull and look awful. So just take your time. As if you were painting many layers with a brush, just paint many layers with the airbrush and just get a solid coverage across all of the white flame that we've just painted, all the way down to sort of where the Ork Weirdboy's hand is. Once we're done with the fluorescent green, you can see that I'll just flick the light off so you can see the full coverage, but obviously the fluorescence will reflect the light, which gives them their really good glowing effect. So now we're going to tone down the green glowing effect, and for that I'm using AK Black Green, which is like Caliban green in the Warhammer range. And the idea here is brighter it is, the hotter, the darker it is, the cooler. So like most flames, it gets cooler the further away from the heat source, and our heat source is the part where it's sort of at the Ork skull, around by his knuckles and hand. So I'm aiming the airbrush back down towards that area, so at the top part of the flame, the cooler part gets darker, and then we sort of almost dry brush with the airbrush. So as I'm spraying downwards along the sort of horizontally along the flame effect, I'm making sure I'm only ever slightly touching all the bits that pop out. So it's like if you were dry brushing very lightly, I'm almost airbrushing very lightly, so that I'm just catching the fine edges with the spray as it comes out. It takes a little bit of practice, but it doesn't take it's not that hard to learn to do. And if you do make a mistake, then we can always just paint it white and start again. It's not the end of the world. So yeah, the idea here is to leave the fluorescent green towards the base, but to get it darker towards the end, and to get some of the top parts of that smoke effect, the dark green, where it is cooling down. We're then going to go another step darker, and for that we're going to be using AK Tenebris Grey. So I add a little bit of that just straight into the airbrush, mix it up, and now we've got a almost black colour. And again, just a few sharp short sprays towards the top of the smoke effect, so that you get a nice Tenebris Grey down to black green, all the way down to fluorescent green at the base. I also here, just any overspray areas we've got, I'm just spraying the model now, just covering those, getting those back to the dark colour, and so that we've basically got our base now back to that matte black primer or Tenebris Grey type mix, but as long as it's dark. So we're going to move on from the smoke now. We've created our initial glowing effect. We'll come back to finish it off a bit later. But now what I want to do is rather large dry brush. I'm just going to dry brush in all of the metal areas. For that I'm using AK gunmetal. I use a big dry brush, I use a little dry brush. I'm just quickly going over where we use the matte black primer. Just a quick dry brush over with some of the metals. It just gives you an instant shading. You don't necessarily have to do it with any Nuln Oil or WAAAGH Earth Shade or anything like that. Stabbing it on, stippling it on. I moved to a smaller dry brush in a minute just so I can get in between the little neck area, but this is just your opportunity to go round and paint the metals. There's not too much, there's mostly around that weird bit of mech around his head, the bits that are hanging off of it, a couple on of his little bit of cloaky skirt thing, and the tip of his staff. So yeah, not too much here. The smaller parts you can use a brush. You could easily brush this on if you wanted to hit it with a bit of Nuln Oil afterwards, but we're going to be adding loads of lighting effects to these anyway, so here we're just getting some basic colour down. So we're going to get some orky flesh going. So I'm going to base coat all of the orc flesh in black green. And We're basically going to be going up from black green all the way up to fluorescent green, and just a few stages to do that. I really wanted some intense highlights with this guy to look like his skin is like pulsing the orc energy, but to get a good highlight you need good depth, and for that, yeah, the AK black green or Warhammer Caliban green. The Warhammer Caliban green is a little bit thin, might need a couple of coats, but this AK black green, you just need one coat of this. And with the magic of Hollywood special effects, we've now base coated all of the orc flesh in the black green, and now on the palette we've got AK deep green, which is a bit moot green, would be close in the Warhammer range, but moot green can be a bit brighter, so you might have to do a little mix. But what I'm doing here is it's a little bit thinned down, and now I'm just going straight on with a highlight. It's our sort of first layer of AK deep green. Picking out all the raised areas, it's easy on the fingers, you just pick out pretty much the majority of the fingers, leaving that black green in the deepest recesses. So yeah, this is where we'll be picking out all of the raised muscle areas, working in towards the center point of each of the muscles. Much paint on the brush. It's on a wet palette, so it's already a little bit watered down, but you always add a little drop of water into the paint as well, just so it flows easier. And it's really hot in the UK at the moment, so it's even more a little bit thinned down because it's drying on very, very quickly, both on the wet palette and on the model. So once we've done our first highlight, we've got quite a garish looking transition between the black green and the deep green. So what I do here is I thin the paint down to a sort of glaze consistency. So there's many parts water to 1 part paint, and then add some black green into it so that we get a mid-tone between the black green and the deep green. And the idea here is I'm now going to be glazing this from the black green into the deep green. So we're sort of overlapping, half in the black green, half in the deep green, to start getting our subtle transition between the dark area and the bright area. So it's almost like if you've ever seen a Venn diagram where you have one group one side, one group the other side, and a circle in the middle that overlaps the two. That's what this mid-tone is. So we've got black green one side, light green the other, and this mid-tone that sits in the middle to help blend the two together. It's a good way of getting good transitions on any of your blending, where you've gone from a dark colour to a light colour, make a mid-tone and cover 50% of each that you've just painted in that colour, and you'll get a really good transition. So yeah, just work yourself around the model. If you lose some of the darkness in the recess, you can always just glaze back in some of the black green into those recessed areas and muscle areas. So yeah, just work around. As you can see, I do sort of in lines glazing. Always remember when you're sort of glazing these colours and painting, the majority of the paint is left where you leave the brush. So we want a majority of the paint here to be left on the deep green side. So we glaze the paint towards that, away from the dark into the light areas. So now in some of the places I might have lost a little bit of the definition, so just going back to that original deep green and just re-highlighting those areas that I really want raised up. Now we're going to start bumping the highlights. And a really good way of getting a nice desaturated highlight, especially with green, where you don't want it to look too yellow, is we're going to get some ice yellow which is sort of dawn yellow in the Warhammer range, and we're going to make a mid-tone. And that mid-tone is going to be between slime. Sorry, we're not going to use the deep green here. We're using slime green. I want to bump up the highlight insanely. So we've got. So if we used ice yellow and deep green, it becomes a mint green, and we don't want a mint green. So this slime green is a really good highlight colour. It's more like moot green, or more greeny orc flesh colour. I've not seen a Warhammer paint like this one. It's very unique. So the idea here is thin the paint down a little bit. A little hair on the brush there because it's a new brush, so it's molting a little bit. And now I'm highlighting all of the raised areas, knuckles, tips of the fingers, where the bone is, where the muscle is really raised up through the skin. All these are getting highlights now. Remember, if we're glazing, you can see that I'm pushing the paint up towards where I want my highlight to be. This really starts giving the flesh some definition now. So it's always about practicing when you're doing your mixes. So when you add a brighter colour to a darker colour, sometimes you might not get the right outcome. As you can see, adding ice yellow to that deep green gave us a mint green, which we didn't. I don't want a mint green. I want a more greeny yellowy look to these highlights. Ork flesh in the Warhammer range takes really well to being highlight because it's quite a yellow green, so it doesn't really turn that mint sort of colour. But certainly in the WAAAGH range, they have a really good range of greens, from really, really darks to really, really brights, and some nice yellowy greens. So all I'm doing now is I'm adding those muscular striations as my highlight. Don't be afraid to add lines, gives the model some texture. Pick out the texture that they've sculpted, but also make your own. And always around the face, we make sure we over highlight the face, so make sure that the mouth, the nose, the tops of the eyes, the cheekbones are always one of our brightest highlights, because that's where the eyes are drawn to, the face and the weapons. And now we want to get some fluorescence on that, but before we get the fluorescence, I want to add a white or almost white color. So for that, we're using the ice yellow. Thinned it down a little bit, so one, it flows off the brush easier, and two, it's not as potent as it can be. It's a very strong color, especially over this green. And here I'm just picturing where I want my fluorescent green to have its most effect. So for me, that's its nose, it's around the jaw, it's the eyes, it's the cheekbones, it's the very tops of the muscle groups. Any veins that Warhammer have sculpted onto those, you can pick those out with this ice yellow, the tips of the knuckles. So this is the sort of final highlight. You could just leave it at this and not do the fine next part, but I think the next part is really worth it. So yeah, just work around. Obviously, as you know, with my tutorials, generally nothing is hidden. I show you pretty much everything. You can see there I'm almost adding in my own little veins as well. Very, very thin lines with a paintbrush, the water thinned down. You can add these little lines and texture marks just to give the model some character, almost like this fluorescence effect we're going to be painting is pulsing through his skin. So with that laid down, we actually hit it with fluorescent yellow. We don't use fluorescent green, we use fluorescent yellow, because fluorescent yellow has the effect of making, if you've got green underneath, it looking like a very, very bright green. So all we do now with the fluorescent yellow is we're just placing it over pretty much all of the areas where we've applied the ice yellow highlight and a little bit of the surrounding area. So we're sort of blending it from those original midtones of the skin up into that ice yellow. And with that, you'll get a really rich, intense, glowing skin that looks like it's pulsing with green energy. Take your time, even if you've thinned down your fluorescent a little bit. Multiple layers on some of those larger, flatter parts is fine. Try not, you don't necessarily need to cover it all in once, because you can get some quite nasty pooling effects with these fluorescents, especially when it dries really, really quick. So now we're going to be using some AK wine red, very, very powerful colour, wine red, and whenever you use it, even if you're thinning it down, it takes a lot of thinning down. So what I wanted to do here was get it in so it covered the tongue and also all of the gums in his mouth. So it's probably 1 drop of paint to about 5 drops of water, and all I'm doing is I'm just painting it inside of his mouth, just so that it sort of there's a slight gum line, so it picks out the gum line, picks out the inside of his mouth, and gives a nice definition between his lips and the inside of his massive gob. I also then just paint it on the whole of his eye, but just making sure it just pulls into the recesses that they've sculpted into those eyes for our glowing effects. Many of our glowing effects, the idea is we want to get all of our base colours down, and then we build up our glowing effects after that. So next, what we're going to be base coating is the leather, which is his staff, his shoes, sort of, the ropes around his shoes, his little cloaky tabardy thing, and the straps that are holding on the metal bit. And what I'm doing is I'm just base coating those in Afro Shadow, which is Rhinox Hide in the Warhammer colours. This is the same leather method that I use for the other Ork miniatures, just so they keep the same theme. So it's covered off in the Big Boss tutorial that I've recently done. This Afro Shadow, what we do with these is we don't generally do a lot of washes over this sort of stuff. So the Afro Shadow is acting like our wash. So when we paint over it, we always leave a little bit of the Afro Shadow in the corners and in the recesses, so that we don't have to go over the top with a wash to create those recesses again. If you want to catch how to paint all of the leather work, just look at the Big Boss tutorial, and that will show you the techniques we used for painting the leather. Colours are Afro Shadow, Deep Brown, Cork, and then some AK Vampiric Flesh to create our leather tones. Very easy to do, just multiple layers of the colours, creating our textures and lines. But yeah, the Big Boss tutorial goes over how to do the leathers. But the Afro Shadow acts as a really good base coat. You then go over it with the Deep Brown, create edge highlights with the Cork Brown. There we can see we've done the leather. The model's already starting to come together. So just with the gunmetal, I'm just painting in some of the smaller details. There's little rings where his leather is hooked into. There's rivets and that dotted around the miniature. So I'm just making sure just to paint those in. These really small little bits, it's worth painting them and taking your time picking them out, because they add so much depth to your miniature. If they're left blank, you notice it. Adding in, just painting in those small details, yeah, it just really adds to the model. especially if you've got a little bit of shade around the rivets. Right, so the next stage, just going to be adding in some hazard stripes. And for this I use just a really bright off-white. I'm using AK Deck Tan, but you could use white for this, but any white or really palish white colour's fine. And these aren't necessarily hazard stripes, they're more like hazard loops around the pipes. And all I do is with the small brush, with the paint slightly thinned down so it flows off the brush easy, is just create just a few flat lines following the shape of the pipe. Doesn't have to go all the way around if it's hard to get to or your eye will never see it. Just cover the parts your eye is generally going to see. Just do some little thick lines as the basis of our hazard stripes. I apply a few of these around the miniature. There's one on the pipe coming from his head, and there's some on the wires coming from his bit of mech around his shoulders. Completely optional to do those. Again, with our character, if we're spending this much time on him, we might as well go that whole extra effort, and it only takes about 10 minutes to do these hazard stripes really. They are quite simple to do. You don't have to worry about painting with yellow. We're just going to glaze over the top of them with contrast Iandan yellow, so that we use the white to pick out the yellow, and then it just, with a wash, just fades in with the rest of the colours. But all we're doing here really is just laying down some simple shapes for our hazard stripes. paints. Then we grab some Mandan yellow, and with a little bit on the brush, not too much, just want to make sure we cover that white. Just paint over all of the pipe where we want the hazard stripe with that Mandan yellow, and it turns the white that we've put down into yellow, and you've just got yourself an instant hazard stripe. Now the next part is really all the sort of pipes that are sticking out from the top of his mech. I've just used two bright colours, AK Deep Blue and AK Deep Red, but any bright reds, greens, any purples, whatever colours you want to do your cables is now the opportunity to do it again. It really adds up when you add these little details onto these models. Try not to paint them all one colour. Any blues, greens, reds work really well on these cables. For the actual covering of those cables, I use some AK deep sea blue and some vampiric flesh, but any desaturated colour will work. And I just mix the two together to sort of create first of all I layer some dark sea blue over where I want my highlight to be. So they were base coated in black, and this is just adding a layer of dark sea blue. And then I add a tiny little bit of that vampiric flesh, but you could use any ivory desaturated colour to create a highlight colour, and then just do a simple edge highlight and just pick out any details that has been sculpted on for those black cables. And to give it all some depth, to tone some of it down a little bit and blend it all together, I just use some Seraphim Sepia wash from Warhammer and just wash it all over the pipes, over the sort of hazard stripe ones, so they blend in. And it just helps, just give some depth, blend those colours together, tone them down a little bit. I don't want them too bright. And the Seraphim Sepia also adds a slight dustiness as well. It's an odd wash. It's not as glossy as some of the others. Maybe this is an old pot of it, because I know some of the shades have become quite glossy now. If it does get a bit too glossy, then just go over it with some matte varnish. But the idea here is, like with most washes, it's to tone it down, to get some depth into those recesses, and it helps blend everything together. So next up is where we start creating some hyper intense glowing effects. So I'll start off with AK Intense White, and I'm just going to paint in the sort of lightning bolt that's coming from the side of his noggin. And then I was picturing where I was thinking a lot of the sort of energy would be pulsating from, where it would be brightest, and using this AK Intense White, almost sketching in very roughly where I want those glowing effects to be, knowing that we'll be able to clear it up in a minute with some sort of well placed white ink washes that we can make, and then the airbrushing over the top of it. But here the first goal is to paint that lightning bolt, and then to do edge highlighting and spots and dots here and there where I want the glowing effect to be most intense. Obviously where it's most intense is where the energy is coming from, where it's hottest. So I work around the miniature, adding this white where it's watered down a little bit, just doing edge highlights and dots and whatever where I want it to be nice and bright and to catch the eye. I also paint it into the core bottom area of the glow coming from his staff, tracing out just some lines, following the contours of the smoke trail that was there. Not too much, but enough so that we can put some more fluorescence over the top of it. So in a separate pot I've made some white ink contrasty mix. So in an old contrast medium pot, it's 1 part water, 1 part Vallejo white ink and 1 part contrast medium, with a sort of magnet ball bearing in the bottom of there just to shake it up. You could make it individually each time, but I just made a big old pot of it so that I don't have to keep worrying about having to mix it all up, because I use this mix quite a lot. And what we create is a sort of white ink contrast paint, so it will flow into all the recesses and become insanely bright white in those recesses. So imagine if you're painting Nuln Oil, it gets really dark in the recesses where that Nuln Oil pools. So the same happens with this inky recess paint that we create. So paint it over the areas where we've just put those dots of white. And what it will start doing is when it dries, it will dry with a gradient. So it will be gradienting itself away back into those pure colours that you've got originally painted, and then gradienting itself in towards the pure white. So you'll create some pure white intenseness that our fluorescents work off of. Be careful here around your other paint areas. I didn't want too much of this colour floating onto his skin or anything like that, because we've already got the fluorescent glow coming from his skin. But anything that goes onto the sort of his bit of mech is fine. Then I also use this to help just blend in where we've put that white into the smoke effect at the base, just so that we get a real intense white at the very base of it. It does take some time to dry, good 10-15 minutes, like any wash or contrast will. Once it is dry, put some more fluorescent yellow from AK on the wet palette, and here I'm just now painting in, going over the white and also a little bit of the surrounding area, the fluorescent yellow onto the smoke effect, making sure I cover all of that white that we've laid down, and just adding little bits here and there just to add some intensity. So like we did with his skin, the fluorescent yellow really brings out the glow of the green. So we're going to use some Green Stuff Well Fluorescent Rose next, and that's going to be the basis of our sort of orangey magenta-y effect that we've got going around the model. So first off, paint on some of the fluorescent rose, making sure to cover all of the white and some of the surrounding area as well, just so it helps blend it. Once that fluorescent rose has dried, I then go back to our just normal white and just paint in now much smaller white edge highlights of the areas that I want to be really, really bright, that we're going to cover with our next fluorescent colour to increase the brightness of our fluorescent rose, but also add a little bit of oddness to the glowing effect by using a colour that you wouldn't necessarily think goes with a sort of fluorescent magenta. So less is certainly more here. These are our sort of top highlights now, and we always do the basing of the fluorescent highlights in white so that it shines even more. For the lightning on the side of his noggin, I want it to be brighter towards where it joins his head and darker at the bottom, so my white highlights are more towards the base where it meets the skull than the very tip. So, AK fluorescent orange, and now we're going to paint over all of the white we've just painted and go over a little bit of the fluorescent rose as well, just so the two blend in together. And to help darken down the fluorescent effects, we're actually going to use a Green Stuff World fluorescent violet with a little bit of water to it, so we create a sort of wash fluorescent colour. And all I'm doing here is I'm just sort of washing this, glazing it down towards where I want it to be darker. So remembering the rule of where you leave your brush, the most paint will be left. I'm just now glazing this into the areas where I want it to be a little bit darker. So away from the hot areas where it's most bright, down into those cooler areas. And this will really help sell the glowing effect. So if you add this to all the base areas of where the glow is furthest away from, it just tones it down a bit, cools it down a bit, and intensifies your glow. Then I do the same principles for the eye. I paint a dot of white in the eye that we already base coated in that wine red, and then go over the top of that with some fluorescent rose, and then do another little dot of white and go over the top of that with some fluorescent orange, so that the glowing effect in his eye matches the glowing effects we've got of the mech on his body. For the teeth and his nails and that, fingernails and claws or whatever, I just make a mix of tenebrous grey from AK and an ivory colour, like a 50-50 mix just to highlight those. For his tongue, I just use AK Dead Red just to highlight the wine red tongue that we originally painted. Once that's all done, I then dry brush the base with AK Mud Brown and AK Light Earth to get subtle gradients. I then coat the whole thing in Dirty Down Rust to get a really dark, grimy base, so that you get a good contrast from his dark base up to his glowing spear and mech effects, so that your eye is naturally drawn upwards. So yeah, cool looking model, pretty quick to do, couple of hours, bit of airbrush usage, but within 2 hours you get yourself a pretty awesome looking Ork Weirdboy, and you can use that Ork colour scheme across all of your Orks and continue the glowing effects across the ones in the range so that it flows through your army. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed the video. Like, comment and subscribe, and happy painting, my fellow painters.